Hello everyone, welcome to the Eternal Patch Breakdown. There have been a number of balance changes announced post our new promo card. So we are going to be getting all of those changes this afternoon, probably about the same time as this video comes up. But we're recording live on Twitch and we're going to talk about each of the changes as it goes. This is a major meta shift up. Like, this is something that is going to really change around everything that's happening in the current meta, and we are going to be talking about some pretty big players getting nerfed or buffed in some pretty interesting ways, not the least of which is Vara Vengeance Seeker, who is finally receiving a nerf, which is kind of crazy. This card has been a popular meta pick for a very, very long time, and now it has just basically been a staple of almost every Shadow deck that's been out there. You basically don't play Shadow without Vara Vengeance Seeker, and now Vara Vengeance Seeker is going from a 3/4 to a 3/3 with the same abilities and same functions. So it will turn into a 5/5 if your opponent does not sacrifice a unit, but your opponent will also be able to sacrifice, torch Vara, and kill Vara without sacrificing anything if they so choose. So you have to be very, very careful now about playing Vara on turns where your opponent has open red power or any sort of decent fire power in general. But as long as you're sort of playing around that, I don't actually expect torch to be too much of a problem for Vara, just because most of the time your opponent won't be leaving up that much power in fire around turn 4. And also, there's going to be a lot of stuff that might take a torch first. So, yeah, the chance that Vara gets hurt by torch is definitely quite possible because she's going to be less likely to play out. But, there are going to be plenty of situations where you wisely choose to hold Vara and play it on a turn where Vara is not going to be torched. So I don't think that's going to be the biggest issue. The main thing that's interesting now about this new Vara change is that Vara is something that can now effectively trade with a lot of other things that were generally not trading with it before. She trades with Sakalis, she trades with Sandstorm Titan. Well, she always traded with Sandstorm Titan, but she basically trades with anything with 5 attack as opposed to just blocking it and getting rid of it completely. So, she actually trades with Sandstorm Titan. She is capable of... She does not survive Sandstorm Titan. She does not survive a lot of other units that are, very, very good at 5 strength. This is actually a really, really big buff to time cards in particular, and we were talking about that new promo almost specifically in the context of it being completely unable to stand up against Vara. Now that that new promo has been, now that this Vara change is coming out, this is actually something that you might actually want to consider for Elysian, to play that Warrior Duelist and have, a little bit of interesting interactions. So should be really, really cool. This is clearly going to make it so that a lot of other things spar with Vara a lot better. I would not say that this is a nerf that is going to take Vara out of the meta completely or even replace her as the staple 4-drop in Shadow. She still has all of the Aegis shutdown, which is very, very important. She still has a deadly body with a very, very large stat line, which is also important, and she still has that sacrifice ability, which is kind of handy with some cool shift tricks right now, and can also be just pretty crazy in a lot of other scenarios. Vara has always been way overstated. Now she is merely overstated and can be swapped out with other cards in certain Shadow decks, but will probably still be a staple of the format. I think that this is a huge change for the meta, though, because there's just so many other cards that become more playable now that they can actually stand up against Vara. Aggro becomes a lot more viable when you actually are able to hold up torches and kill Vara at certain times, or hold up torches and keep pressure with a bunch of smaller units. Skycrag aggro gets a big buff here, Bracano aggro gets a big buff here. This just opens up Vara to a lot more interesting removal. Also, she can be killed by Clan Tactic, which was a blue primal removal that was not used very much, but could definitely see use now that the only preeminent 6 health 4-drop is Sandstorm Titan. There are some pretty interesting things that you can play around with here now that Vara has been nerfed, and I think that overall that's going to represent a pretty significant change to the meta. If you don't know the meta right now, what's basically going on is that we have a pretty large contingent of Stonescar, probably around 20% to 18% of the meta, crazy stuff like that, and then everything else is pretty well balanced. Stonescar is in a very good shape. It's not completely out of control, but it's definitely quite powerful, and there's a lot of other good decks that are being addressed, specifically Evenhanded Katra and Praxis Pledge, which are being addressed in this patch. So let's talk about those as well, but first things first, the other Stonescar nerf that's going to be a big one. Statuary Maiden Maiden is coming down from a 2/4 to a 2/2. I think anyone who's watched my stream might know that I have a low opinion of this card. I've actually always kind of thought it should be a 2/3 or a 2/2. This is something where, like, basically it gives you a really, really solid void recursion shutdown. It trades well with everything, and it is very, very capable of just doing, like, some interesting things by being pulled out of the market or by being just a constant in your Stonescar decks. It has a kind of win more attachment to it, and the stat line on it is just like a little bit low, but it's always been able to spar with just about anything, and it doesn't die to Torch or any of the standard removals, so it always requires you to deal with it in a way that is pretty aggressive. I actually think that this card is, this is my favorite nerf, I think, out of the whole patch. Like, I think this is something that really enables a lot of interesting things with void recursion, and also allows you to interact with Statuary Maiden in a way that is meaningful, as well as makes it so that Statuary Maiden involves more difficult choices. Do you play this card on 4, or do you try to delay it for later when you actually have removal up, so that you can play the Statuary Maiden, throw a torch on something, and then put a weapon on Statuary Maiden to bring her back up to the point where she cannot be torched? Like, there's going to be a lot more vulnerability in her patterns now, and that doesn't necessarily mean that she's going to be unplayable, but it should mean that she's going to be something that, like, you have to be a lot more careful with if you want to use her for her intended effect, which is to prevent Entombs and Revenges, and to just basically mess up your opponent's recursive stuff in a pretty serious way. Still a pretty strong market card. 2 health is a lot. I'm really surprised that they took an entire 2 points of health off of it, and that might actually send that card into obscurity. But I think if it gets absolutely no play after this, they might bring it back up to a 2/3. At the moment, I think that 2/2 is fine, and Statuary Maiden still has enough of a potential upside that it's something you can definitely pull out of the market in a situation where you need it. So, very glad to see this nerf. This is actually one of my favorite nerfs in the set, and the other one that I think definitely needed to happen was Evenhanded Golem. So I had mixed opinions on Evenhanded Golem as it sort of cycled through the meta. It definitely prompted a lot of interesting types of decks, but eventually the thing that got settled on was a lot of, like, very oppressive shadow decks, specifically Evenhanded Katra, which is a very big recursive engine deck that runs a lot of combo pieces and then just infinite combos out, or builds a very, very large hand of units with Evenhanded Golem, and it's very hard to interact with. And 1 second while I address that. I don't know. All right. So, like, basically, we are capable of... the thing that has been changed about Evenhanded Golem is that Evenhanded Golem now has Void Bound, so it cannot be brought back to life by shadow cards. Instead, the only value that you're going to be getting out of it is if you give it, like, recursion through cards like Mirror Image or other things like that. And you can't Mirror Image it, you have to sudden Schism it or something along those lines. So this basically means that Evenhanded Golem, while still providing a significant card advantage to even decks, no longer is a repeatable effect with cards like Haunting Scream, Dark Return. Evenhanded Feln is no longer as much of a problem, and Evenhanded Katra is no longer as much of a problem. So I think that recurring Evenhanded Golem is definitely, like, a really, really strong play. We built this mono shadow deck that we went, I think, 27 and 11 with in the monocolor setup, so we're still, like, top 100 with that deck, and after playing with that deck, my thoughts on Evenhanded Golem was that it was just the best 2-drop in those, like, setups, and since it ended up being, like, stronger than Tazbu in almost every scenario, I changed my opinion on this card quite a bit. I had already been getting kind of sick of the Evenhanded Katra stuff, so yeah, this is something that should, like, sort of put that card a little bit back in control while still allowing people to build interesting even-handed decks. There should be some more Rakano even-handed and other types of even-handed decks that were fun and interesting, and the shadow decks that were so very oppressive should be significantly less present as a result of this. That's a very, very good change, so I'm super down with it. Daria, Warrior Poet is getting hit. This card's actually going up to 5. It's going to be a 3/5 instead of a 3/4. So 5 costs 3/5, Berserk Deadly Pledge with the same amplifies. That extra cost is a really, really important change. So Praxis Pledge decks have been pretty dominant for a while now. They're very, very strong. They run a lot of interesting stuff with Gunrunner, Moonstone Vanguard, Daria, Warrior Poet, Sakalis the Burning Sand, and Glasshoppers, of course. And you can just do ridiculous things with them all the time. That just made the Praxis Pledge deck very, very strong and was always a very, very strong choice in general. Darius has a very good amplify and a very, very good stat line overall. She trades really well with everything, and she makes everything else trade well with everything. Playing her on 6 usually was a game winner in those Praxis Pledge decks. Now you have to wait until turn 7 to do that kind of effect, and that may make her a lot less worth it, particularly because, like, with the Glasshopper reductions, that was respectively 5 and 6. So slowing down this card, I think, really, really helps, especially with Glasshopper being as dominant a card as it is. So this should be an interesting change-up that should make Praxis Pledge decks a little less viable, but not as much of a change-up as the change to Moonstone Vanguard. Moonstone Vanguard has gone from a 5/5 to a 4/4. This is probably the change I most disagree with in terms of, like, what they're hitting and why they're hitting it. So, like, this is one of those changes to Praxis Pledge decks which were significantly dominant. Like, there's some pretty interesting stuff. They definitely wanted to take some action against Praxis Pledge, and Praxis Pledge has been doing some pretty ridiculous things in general, but I am not sure if as a 5-cost 4/4 this card is as viable, and also I found that this card was pretty interesting time card in general. It seemed like something that Time could really play around with and do some interesting things with. So, like, Pledge decks really, really liked it. It was very powerful. It did a lot of cool things against aggro. This is one of the things where it's probably a good change because it does, like, allow for other strategies to take more dominance, and it definitely hits Praxis Pledge, but I feel like hitting Gunrunner or other options in Time might have been, like, a slightly better choice, because Moonstone Vanguard is a card that, like, as a 5-drop feels very, very suitable, particularly as a rare for new players to pick up that will generally help them sort of excel early on. And this is something that might increase the overall cost of available decks, especially since, like, Vara, the campaign card, is getting nerfed, and a lot of legendaries in this current setup are getting buffed. So this one's curious. I think it might be a positive change, and certainly Moonstone Vanguard could be oppressive at times, but this is maybe the one that I'm, like, the least sure of out of the 5 major nerfs. So that's an interesting one for sure. I think it should be fine, but should definitely change up the meta. It probably could have been done a different way, but I'm not going to complain too much about it being done this way. All right, next up, Icaria, the Liberator, is going back to 7. Was a 7-drop before, went up to 8. Once it was up at 8, nobody really played it. And then also, like, the thing that happened was that Vara had already kind of been making Icaria a little less viable. So this is an interesting one because Icaria is a pretty scary card at 7 still. And the other thing that, like, really put Icaria in check was the existence of Vara the Fate Touched, or Vara Vengeance Seeker, which allowed you to basically shut down Aegis cards in general. So this is a very big nerf to Icaria. Should give Rakano, like, a really interesting top end once again, and Rakano hasn't really had a top end for a while, so that seems like something that might be pretty viable. But actually there's been some pretty good stuff with Razan, like, playing out. I've actually really enjoyed those Razan setups. So yeah, it'll be interesting. I'm curious to see exactly how this all plays out. I think the Icarias are probably going to be just fine. They shouldn't be too much of an influence on the meta. They're a very powerful card in general, but we have so many different toolkits to deal with at Aegis at the moment, and Vara is still probably going to be played. I don't know. This one's interesting, but I would say overall Icaria is everyone's baby, and it's nice to have Icaria back. So hopefully we'll see some cool stuff with it. It is, like, one of the premier cards of the Eternal set. Where's my Channel the Tempest nerf, or Channel the Tempest buff? I want that back. Yeah, the other card which I much less agree with is Bartholo the Seducer, who is going back to 3 from 4. So this was another Aegis card that's getting, like, a pretty serious buff. This is clearly a buff to Argenport decks in general, but I remember the days of Bart Lithrai Falchion being not pleasant, and a lot of the other Bart decks that existed were also not pleasant. Like, this card is kind of stone uninteractable for the most part, and Vara really kind of shut it down in the first place, so it's fine to nerf it back to 3, but I don't know why you would. Like, this card is meh. Anyways, it does draw relics of your choice on occasion, but that's never been the main point of Bart, as much as it would be really nice if it was. They reduced the cost of that ultimate a while ago to try and make it more capable of Bart to actually focus on drawing a relic of your choice from your deck, but paying 7 is a really, really steep price, and Bart is usually winning the game by the time that happens. So, I don't know. This one is, like, probably my least favorite nerf out of all of them. Like the major 5 had Moonstone Vanguard, and that one's like a little bit interesting. This one, like, I just don't know why this card is back. It's a little bit strange. There's one other card that got buffed that I'm not 100% sure of, but like, yeah, as far as buffs go, like this one's a little bit strange to me, especially since Argenport still has plenty of interesting tools and currently has access to like some pretty strong stuff in mono Justice, including Sediti. So there's plenty of interesting things for Justice to do right now. Bart doesn't really feel like anything that the whole setup needed. The Banish change is really interesting. Banish is going up from kill an enemy unit or relic with cost 4 or less to kill an enemy unit or relic with cost 5 or less, meaning, among other things, drawing a Banish will allow you to hit Sediti's Curse, which, I am really, really happy about that. So this gives you really flexible relic removal as well as really flexible unit removal at 3 at fast spell. And I think that this might actually be the most powerful 3-drop removal in the set now, or in any of the sets now. Like, Slay is typically considered one of the most powerful ones since it is a slow spell and can kill anything, but Banish might actually have a little bit more flexibility just for its ability to be used on any number of different relics and a wide variety of extremely powerful units. Like, this is pretty crazy. I think this is a huge buff to Banish. This card is nuts powerful now and should be a 4 of in almost any Xenon deck. Yeah, I would say definitely go for this card if you can, because yeah, it's not this might be the sleeper buff of the set. It's very, very strong, and Xenon should see a lot of increase in power as far as things go when you are seeing this kind of thing setting up. So yeah, it's pretty crazy stuff. Knight Chancellor Seraph, going down to 7 from 8 on her ultimate ability, which is not an ultimate ability, it's a reusable ability. So yeah, Seraph has been pretty dominant in the set before, so it's interesting to see her coming back. I find this buff interesting since, like, basically Seraph is already, there's a new Seraph out, and the new Seraph's pretty fun. She's good to play with. You can do some cool things with her. So it's interesting to see, like, good Seraph be a little bit more, a little bit more of playable. You can now drop her on 10 in those big expensive decks and immediately get a doubled time or justice unit. This card is really oppressive top end. You can do some pretty crazy stuff with it, but it's also some of the more fun top end of the whole set. I've talked a lot about how much I hate Martyr's Chains and how little I appreciated that card for being the top end in justice decks. Knight Chancellor Seraph fills that slot very nicely, and she's always been a lot more fun than Martyr's Chains in terms of how control decks play out. In fact, she's always been sort of the most, like, interesting and entertaining top end 2 big justice decks that I've seen. So, like, I'm super happy to see this card get buffed, I think, and, like, overall this seems like a really decent change up. Should be kind of fun. Seraph's Choice is now 7 instead of 8. So I have said that this should be 7 for a very, very long time. This is a really late nerf, or really late buff, but, like, it's fine. I don't even know if Seraph's Choice is in draft right now, which is where Seraph's Choice is generally quite viable, as long as it costs 7 and not 8. In ranked, this is probably still not playable at 7. It might be pretty good. Like, it's an okay way to sort of clear a game, as well as a good way to get a unit with a lot of interesting, like, gas to it, but it's a slow spell still, so there's a lot of possibility for this not to really, like, influence your battlefield in a way that's going to be too powerful. Obviously, as a fast spell, this card would be broken in half, so it makes sense that it's a slow spell. But yeah, going down to 7 is nice. That certainly makes it more playable in limited formats, if indeed it still exists in limited formats, and hopefully there's some cool ranked decks that can use it now. Shush is now 2 as opposed to 3, so this card's going down at 1 in cost. I don't love it. This card has always sort of been like the premier card of fun police decks from people who want to, like, really grief their opponents. This is something to give time, apparently more toolkits to deal with difficult units. I think that's interesting. I think different cards could have been buffed to really sort of make that happen. But yeah, it's fine. Like, certainly Shush is a decently powerful card now. I'm hoping not to see a lot of it because this card is, like, always turned off, like, a lot of the interesting parts of your deck pretty frequently. And Eternal has a lot of mass hate, where it just, like, picks a particular card and says you can't really play that card anymore. And those are interesting balancing factors, particularly in a set without any rotation, but also, like, I'm more rooting for rotation than the presence of cards like Shush. So yeah, this is something that's unusual, but not, like, anything that I'm super happy to see. Alright, right, Twilight Hunt. This one is a 1-cost Nightfall change where the dinosaur can get +2/+2 instead of +1/+1, which is a very big buff to dinosaurs. Like, there are a lot of scary dinosaurs that you can Twilight Hunt now and get some really, really good results from. So, like, basically, this will now allow you to buff, for example, the 1/4 Dinosaur Explorer with Shift and get it up to a 3/5 for using its killer ability to get some more dinosaurs out. That alone is just something that makes Twilight Hunt a lot more interesting to play. But also, this card has always played pretty well on cards like World Bear Behemoth, very, very large dinos, very, very small dinos, and Killer has always been a pretty useful effect in general. I have used this card in place of Predator's Instinct for a very long time because the drawback of Nightfall is usually something that you can control pretty well, and the dinosaur buff is usually almost always worth it and quite a lot of fun to play with. So I have been saying buff dinos for a very long time. Dinosaurs are really fun. They're very interesting cards in the set, and they're always, 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 always underpowered. No one's ever really built like the big tribal dino deck and taken it into like tournaments and actually won a lot of tournaments with it. And maybe this is the card that changes that. Maybe some big dino decks will finally be like tier 1 or tier 2 because they've always fallen a little bit behind in comparison to other tribal decks. And that's a shame because big dinosaurs are fun and Timmies should have fun too, playing up against all of them spikes. So yeah, I think that like overall that seems like a really good way to sort of make the big dino people happy. This seems like a good buff. Maybe it's the last good buff to dinosaurs that we need to see. Another change that happens in this particular buff patch is that Shimmer Pack is finally becoming a dinosaur illusion. So we will see at least that happening along with all of your other interesting Shimmer Pack stuff. So good stuff on that front. That's the full list of buffs and nerfs. There are also a number of unit type updates. I'll go through these very fast. There's not going to be a lot of comments on these because most of it doesn't really change anything. Some of it is for clarity's sake. Some of it is adding the rogue subtype to a number of gunslingers and interesting red cards, which suggests that there is going to be a rogue tribal format or a rogue tribal card of some kind coming up in upcoming sets. There's also some changes to Oni, which is interesting. A lot of the Oni are losing their jobs. And like, yeah, we have a couple of birds that are becoming birds as opposed to raptors. We have some other like interesting changes where a couple of more things have become unseen. So we might be seeing another tribal set in the future, or this might just be some cleanup stuff. Let's go through it real quick. Cinder Sprite is now a sprite instead of an elemental sprite. Dinomancy Enthusiast is now an explorer shaman instead of a dinosaur explorer. I don't think Dinomancy Enthusiast actually is a dinosaur in the whole setup, but does transform into a dinosaur, so that makes sense. Fireheart Recruit, now an Oni instead of an Oni warrior. Lightning Sprite, now a sprite instead of an elemental sprite. That was a weird dual change anyways. Nostrix Lord of Vision is now an unseen owl instead of just an owl. This one's kind of interesting since a lot of the unseen owls have been unseen riding owls, and most of the owls are not unseen, so that one's a little bit strange, but sure, I'm down with it. Oni Patrol, now an Oni instead of an Oni Soldier. Quick Trigger Outlaw, now a Rogue in addition to a Gunslinger. Rakano Outlaw, now a Rogue in addition to a Gunslinger. Rallying Sergeant is an Oni. Rindra the Duskblade is now an Unseen and an Elf. Scavenger Vulture is now a bird. Shadowlands Feaster is now a dire beast instead of a spider. So raptor to bird, spider to dire beast. Shadowlands Feaster is still a spider, so I'm kind of surprised it's not a spider dire beast since there is a dire fang spider. But if dire fang spider is also a dire beast, that would make sense. I'm pretty sure it's also a spider, so that's interesting. Shimmer Pack Dinosaur Illusion. Shingani Captain, now an Oni. Shingani Firebrand, now an Oni. Silverwing Familiar, now a bird instead of a raptor. Twilight Raptor, now a bird instead of a raptor. That's pretty good. Unpredictable Outlaw, now a Gunslinger Rogue instead of a Gunslinger. Vicious Highwayman, also a Rogue. Wild Rider, we're going to save that one for last. Yeti Troublemaker is now a Yeti Rogue. Wild Rider, now a Yeti Pig. Which, not the only pig in the game. You can transform units into pigs through Cerso's Cleaver and Cerso's Meddling, but if you want to do some pig tribal with Maskmaker, now you can do pig tribal. You can have 3/3 pigs. And 6/6 pigs. Cerso is also a pig. Yes, that's very true. So yeah, minor tribal changes, not too much interesting happening there, except for the addition of the elf subtype to Rindra, which allows Rindra to be affected by certain elf decks. The addition of, including Zende, which is wild. That's a huge buff to Zende, the Heartbinder. And then, like, also the Dinosaur change to Shimmerpack is kind of interesting, although maybe not, like, actually a big thing. And then, like, the Unseen Owl might make a mild change to some decks. The only current Unseen tribal card is Deadly Confrontation. But this all seems like future-proofing for upcoming patches. So, in conclusion, very large meta shakeup. Aggro should be a lot better. A lot of mid-range should be a lot better because mid-range can spar with Vara significantly more. So low-end mid-range to tempo is going to be like a faction that's actually a little bit more available. And I can see a lot of like single decks like the standard like Praxis, just big stuff, being a lot more popular as a result of these changes. We have nerfs to Praxis Pledge, which I'm good riddance. We have nerfs to Unseen and Evenhanded Katra, or Evenhanded Katra and Evenhanded Feln, which also good riddance. Those were kind of scourges of the meta for a while. Stone Scar is definitely not in as powerful a place, so that's going to be pretty interesting. And I would say that this is probably one of the best times ever to just dig into your collection, explore any sort of interesting card, and reevaluate it in the context of the new Vara and the context of new setups, because there is a ton of stuff that you can do now that you couldn't do before in the previous meta. This is a huge shakeup, so if you are the type of person who wants to have like the big tier 1 deck, you should be brewing right now, because this is like the absolute perfect time to do it. It's absolutely the Wild West out there. There's some crazy, crazy stuff going on, so go check it out. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will be back with more Eternal stuff very, very soon. As always, you can subscribe, you can hit the bell, and you can find me on Twitch TV/LocoPojo, where we are going to go play some games. See you in a moment, guys. Thank you so much for watching.